Hello and welcome back to the Yi2 tutorial series, and in this video I want to look at role-based access control, otherwise known as rbac. And the basic idea here is that we want to set up security permissions for authorization in order that in each place, in each controller, in each view, we can be both checking that the user has permission to even see certain buttons and menus and what have you, and also to make sure that even if that user tries to go directly to a controller action that they don't have permission for, that the system will prevent them from doing it. So the information in this tutorial is largely based on the guide documentation in GitHub under YiSoft Yi2, and under docs guide directory is one called security authorization, and that goes into quite good detail about how all of the authorization works in Yi2, but I found some of the parts slightly difficult to understand, so I thought I would modify the information in it slightly for this video and then show some practical examples of how it actually looks in our project. So first off, there is already an access control mechanism built into Yi by default, and that's called the access control filter, otherwise known as the ACF. And with access control filter, because it doesn't actually tap into the user system, because by default there is no user mechanism, then the access control filter can't really do very clever things. It can't ask what permissions or what roles a certain user has, because that information doesn't exist by default. So even though we've now added the ability to have users in a database, and even though they have a static role assignment, the access control filter really is a very basic system, and you've seen it at the top of some of your controllers. It can basically question things like, is the user anonymous or are they authenticated? And then it can filter further by the actions being requested, and then each rule can have an allow or a deny specification, and you can also add a certain amount of filtering by IP address or by the request verb. So you could say that people are not allowed to call a certain action using get, they can only use post. And there is an amount of customization you can also do with the functions that are called when a rule is actioned, and also how to decide whether the rule should in fact be used at all. And the way it works quite basically is the system will go down the rules in order, and the first rule that matches the user accessing the action, so the one matched by whether they are anonymous or authenticated and what action they are requesting, the first rule that matches will dictate whether that user is allowed or denied permission. Even if there is another rule afterwards that does something different, the first rule that matches will determine either allow or deny for that user. But this is really quite basic, and it doesn't allow us to do anything more complicated, because in reality on any decent system we're going to have a whole manner of different actions that a user can carry out, and lots of these will vary in terms of their permissions. Maybe all users, maybe only the administrator, maybe support staff, maybe supervisors. Obviously there's lots of different ways that we could set that up, and the access control filter is really not capable of dealing with all of that. So the idea of the role-based access control is that we create a hierarchy, and ultimately if we look at the permission end of this, all we're really asking the system to do is say, does this user have permission to create a post, update a post, delete a post, or whatever else it might be. You can have obviously as many of these as you like, and ideally you tend to have one permission per action at least, although sometimes you might have a few more as well. So there might be some specific permissions underneath create post, so maybe the type of post that the user can create, or the date or time that they are allowed to create it. So you could have as many permissions if you like it, and this is the entry point for the role-based access control, is asking the question, can the current user or a specific user do this? Do they have permission? So at the other end we could say, well, we obviously need to map our users to these various permissions. So the most obvious way to do this is to say, well, user 1 can create an update, user 2 can do all 4 of these, user 3 can only create an update. But since every single arrow on this diagram represents a row in a database, clearly this solution is not very scalable, and as soon as you have a few hundred or a few thousand users, then the authorization assignments will really be far too complicated to manage. And really what we need is a way of logically grouping these things together. So what we do with role-based authorization control is we use this concept of a role. And this is not unique to Yi. This is a standard. The guide says it's based on a NIST document that is trying to standardize the way in which these systems are defined. So we have a concept of a role, and the roles are here in orange. And a role is really a way of grouping together a number of permissions. Now, when we see the database tables, there is almost no difference in the database between a role and a permission. The only difference is there is a type, and the type is 1 for role and 2 for permission, or possibly the other way around. But what this allows us to do is allows us to create very obvious concepts of permissions. So in this example, we've created a user role, and the user role only in this example has 1 permission. And we're then saying that user 1 and user 2 are both in the user role. And likewise, in this case, the admin role has 4 permissions, and user 3 is in the admin role. So this is really all that rbac is about. It's about how we set this up, and really understanding the logic and understanding how to set all of this up is really the most difficult part of using rbac. When it actually comes to using this in code, it's actually very, very easy to do. But designing this, deciding how you're going to set it up for your particular system, they are the questions that are worth spending some time on. Because if you make this too simple or too complicated, then you will have problems later on with maintenance. So what we can also do in the system is we can have multiple levels, and so in the rbac system in Yi and in other frameworks, you're allowed to create multiple levels of hierarchy. So in this instance, what we're saying is, rather than making admin have the create post permission directly, then the easiest thing to do would be to say, well, admin has its own permissions, and it also has all of the permissions that a user has. And what that means is, if we change the permissions that users can have, then admin will automatically inherit all of those without us having to link them directly like these. So that's quite a useful concept, and it means that in some systems admin might have no direct permissions and might inherit all of its permissions directly from other roles that it is the parent of. And in this case, user then has a single permission like before, but one thing that's not allowed is a permission is not allowed to have a role as a child. So a role can have permissions and other roles, and a permission is not allowed to have any child roles, but permission can have child permissions. So once you've become a permission, you can't go back to being a role later on. And that's important, because if you break that rule, although you can physically do that, it will break the logic in the permission checking. And what it will mean is a lot of your permissions will stop working properly. So a role is allowed to have permissions, all roles, but a permission can only have other permissions as children. So in this example, here we can now extend this and say, well, okay, we've kind of looked at something fairly simple so far, but in reality some permissions are conditional. So for instance, if we have an administrator, we've already decided that they are allowed to update a post in our system. But what about a user? When can a user update a post? And we might say, well, a user is allowed to update a post, but only if it's the post that they created in the first place. So an admin can always update a post, but a user can only update a post if it belongs to them. And again, the system in Yi allows us to do this. And the way we do this is we create a permission that has a rule attached to it. Now the rule is actually a code class, so we create a class that has the logic in it to decide whether this permission is allowed to be given or not. And in this case, what's interesting is we have made update own post a parent of update post. Now we don't have to do that, but the reason we do that is it then means in our system all we have to do is ask, can the user update the post? And the rest of it will happen automatically. Whereas if that was a separate permission and this relationship wasn't there, we would have to say, can the user update the post, or can they update their own post? And that doesn't sound quite so neat, and it doesn't read so well in code. So by making this a parent, it allows us just to use a single permission in code, and the actual hierarchy in the database will sort everything out. So how does it work? Well, in this first example, user 3, who is an administrator, wants to update their own post. Now what the code does when you ask for permission is obviously using the database to work to find out all the information about these rules and about the hierarchy. It starts down here with the permission you have asked for, and then it goes through the database and it says, first off, is there any rule in here? And if there is a rule attached to the permission, then it must execute and return true. If it doesn't, then you're immediately thrown out and you don't have permission. If there is no rule, or if the permission succeeds, then for each parent of this permission, so in this case it would check update own post as well as admin. So for each of those, it will then ask two questions. Firstly, is this a role that the user is part of? Now in this case the answer is yes, and so the permission would return true. If the answer is no, this isn't a role that the user is a part of, then it will ask if it is a default role, and we can look at that later, but the basic idea is if it's a default role, then every user gets it by default without it being assigned in the database, and in which case the user would be given permission. And if neither of those are true, then if this has any parents, then it will carry on recursing. In this case there are no parents. And in this case, if it actually went up this way, the permission would also be granted. So in this example, actually there would be two routes if you were looking at the post that the admin had created. But in this case, we reach here, we find a role that the user is a member of, and so permission is granted. For our second example, what happens if user 1 wants to update a post? So what happens here is we start at the same place because we're asking for the same permission. In this case, it would look at both parents, and of course it might do this in either order. But if it went up this route, it would say, right, I found a role. Is user 1 a member of this role? No. And does this role have any parent roles or permissions? No. So in which case that's a dead end. And if it goes up this route, then it's going to reach another permission. And the first question is this a role that the user is a member of? And the answer is no, because it isn't actually a role. So then it's going to say, does this permission have a rule attached? The answer is yes. Does this rule succeed? If the rule succeeds in this case, then it will carry on recursing, and the very next question will be, is this a role the user is a member of? The answer is yes, in which case permission will be given. Obviously, if that rule doesn't succeed, then this journey doesn't carry on, and if that were the case, then neither of these two routes would give permission to the user and it would be denied. So if we look at a slightly different example, what happens if user 3, who is an admin, wants to create a post? So the system asks, can this user create post? There's no rule attached, so it only has one parent, so it immediately goes up and says, is this a role that the user is in? Now the answer is actually no, because user 3 is not a member of the user role. But in this case, user does have a parent, so it will carry on the journey and reach admin and then say, is this a role the user is a member of? And the answer is yes. So in this example, the user 3 will be given permission to create the post. So how do we implement this? Right, let's jump back into our code. Fortunately, Yi have been very helpful in this respect, and if we look in our Yi framework code and look under the rbac directory, we'll see there is a migrations folder, and this migrations folder has a Yi type migration, which hopefully you should be familiar with by now. We covered that in a previous video, but it also has, if you would prefer, and if you're doing this from the beginning, the SQL that you can run directly on the database, and they've got a flavor of this for various different types of database like Postgre and MySQL and what have you. And I decided that I think for source control reasons it would be best for me to use the migration script. So I went into the console like I've done before. I created a migration and I pasted in the code from that other file down in the framework. Now I could have copied the file directly, but the problem with doing that is the date stamp on this is much older than my other migrations, so it would screw up the migration process. And if I've already run that migration and I tried to run migrate with an older script, nothing would happen because the system would think I've already applied the older one. So I created a new one, copied the code across, and the only difference is I decided to use the safe up and safe down methods. And the reason for that is safe up and safe down will wrap all of these calls into a transaction. And in the case of creating more than one object, it makes sense that if one of these fails, I don't want the rest of them to be created. I want the whole thing to fail because that means I've got an error and I need to fix it, and then I can run it all again. So I created that migration and I ran it, and if we look at our database, it creates 4 tables. So auth item is, of course I've got to log back in again. Auth item is the lowest level, the permissions and the roles. So every permission has an entry in here, and you see they're type number 2. So we'll look at these ones that look a bit weird later on, but I have a permission called permission_admin, and the description is permission to add or set up or modify any permissions. So it's fairly straightforward. And then if you notice on this row, I have sysadmin, which is type 1, which means it's a role. And I obviously could have hundreds and hundreds of rows in here, but I've only got a few at the minute. And then auth item child determines what is a parent of what. So in this case, you can see because the key is using text rather than numbers, it's very easy to read what's going on. So sysadmin is allowed that root, sysadmin is allowed that root, and sysadmin is also given the permission admin permission. So that's fine. So our sysadmin role is number 1. The third table, auth assignment, says which user, in this case user ID 3, which is me, which is the only user, has the sysadmin role. So that's great. Again, this I could be given permissions and other roles and all kinds of stuff. So I can have multiple rows in here for each user. And then the other table, which I haven't used yet, is what happens when you create a rule for one of your permissions, and the rule gets serialized and copied into this table to be used when your permission has a rule attached to it. So they're all created, and I've set up some permissions. Now, one of the things that you'll probably find out fairly quickly when you use rbac is that the maintenance of it is quite difficult because you don't get an administration tool as part of Yi. So what you get is you get some database tables and you can access them directly and you can type stuff in directly, but that's clearly not very usable, and it's very hard to debug. So it turns out that there is a plugin called Yi2-admin, or an extension if you like. And so I decided to give this a go. It's not perfect, but it's certainly a lot better than using the database tables directly. So what we have to do is we have to go into our web system and we create an auth manager entry, and that points to DB manager. That's the built-in class, not the extension. And one thing I forgot to mention is you also have to add that in your console config before you run that migration. If you don't do that, the migration will error and it will show you that error there. You should configure Auth Manager before you run this. So I'm sorry I forgot to mention that. So that's in console. It's also in web, so we've set that up. And then, like most Yi2 extensions, all of these things are now available via Composer. So what we do is we modify our Composer JSON file, and in this case, under the require section, I've added in that line, and that line is just a path to Yi2 admin, the extension. And then I go into my console here, into the Yi directory, and I just run Composer update. And Composer update now has seen this new addition. It also updated some of the other packages as well. And what it then creates for you underneath vendor, in this case MDM soft, and here's all the various pieces of code for that. But I'm not supposed to touch anything under vendor, so that's all fine. Once that's installed, I then need to make some further modifications to my web config. So the first is, in order to use this as a module, in order for it to be loaded and be available, I need to specify in my config that in the modules array is a module called admin, and it's going to point to this module that I've just downloaded in using Composer. And admin means it will be given the root admin by default. You can obviously change that, and that means that if I go onto the end here and I type admin, it may or may not do something. Okay, it's taken me straight to, by default, the assignments page. Now, one of the problems I think with this plugin is there is no top level page. I think that's a bit of a problem, so you could do something yourself to actually rectify that. But what you need to do is you need to know all of the different pages, which you can obviously find out in code, but you have role, you have permission, you have assignments, you have all kinds of stuff. So the pages themselves work fine, but it's not very easy to coordinate between them. So in my case, I went into permission and created a permission called permission admin. And then in this case, I went into role, and again, you can do this however you want. I then created a role called sysadmin, and then rather than editing the role, if you view the role, this then gives you the anything that's available, and then I can apply them to this role. Now in this case, I've only actually got 3 items, 2 roots and 1 permission, and as it happens, I've assigned them all over to sysadmin. Clearly, if I created a user, so if I go back and I create a role, let's go to roles. So if I create a role, I could create a default one called user, and it could be basic user can do anything that a restricted user can do. In this case, it's not going to have a rule. I'm just going to give this to everybody by default, and I've got no data to put in there. So I've now got a user, and as you can see, these are all of the things that are available. Now, a user is not going to be a sysadmin, although a sysadmin could be a user. We talked about that earlier. And a user is definitely not going to be able to have permission admin. But I think one of the things that I want to do is I want to let a user access certain routes. But we'll look at that later because we haven't really touched routes yet. But you can see that using these pages, we can kind of set up our hierarchy. And then in code, it's very, very straightforward then. So we've done all of that. And then if we look at, say, a layout file, I think that's a layout file. This is the kind of way in which we use it. So this method already exists in the web user. So we call Yi app user can, and in this case, permission admin, which remember was the 1 permission that I created, and I can say if they can permission admin, I mean maybe I should have called it administer permissions or something, it would have read more clearly, but in that case I add an additional item to my menu called permissions, which goes to admin assignments. So now that I've done that, if I go back to my site here, we can look, there is no permissions menu item, which is fine. Now if I log in as me, and remember at the minute I'm the only user, Because I am a sysadmin, and that's an assignment there, you see I've now got my permissions button. So what's happened is that code has said, can the current user do it? Well, when I'm logged in as Luke, the current user can do permission admin, so it shows me the permissions button, and if I click that, it takes me to my assignments. Now, that all looks great, but the thing with security, particularly with authorization, with access control, is there are two sides to it, and at the minute I've only actually taken care of one side. Now, what do I mean? I mean, if I log out, and I go back to the home page, there is no permissions link there, and that's correct because the user shouldn't be obviously invited to do things that they're not allowed to do. But of course the problem here that you might have already guessed is what happens if I go into it directly. And the answer is I can go in. And why is that? Well, it's because even though I've hidden the button to get there, I haven't actually restricted access to this, either this controller or to this action. And there's a couple of different ways I can do this. If I was only dealing with my own controllers, so for instance, say I've got one open, say an author controller, I could use the normal behaviors like we saw in the access control list, and I could say that the user requires a certain permission in order to do that. Now, there's two problems with that. One of them is that you end up having to go into an awful lot of code, because effectively what we're saying at the minute is everything is open by default, and it will only be closed off if we specifically close it off. So that would require us going through every controller. But more importantly, it would also require us going into things like these extensions, like the admin extension, and modifying someone else's code, which is not really going to work very well, because as soon as we update that package, we're going to lose all of our changes. So the question is, what can we do about that? And the great answer is that this plugin has provided something called routes. And the routes are your controller and your action routes, and you can enable them. You don't have to enable them. By default they're not enabled, but if I go back to my configuration, which is there, this thing here that I've commented out, if I uncomment that, now what actually happens here is we're saying that as an access control filter, we're bringing in this class from the plugin that I've just downloaded. So if I actually comment out the allowed actions, now what's going to happen is by default nobody is allowed to access anything, and the only access that you're allowed is what you're given in the database. So it effectively has flipped the switch and said that you cannot access anything unless you're allowed to. So what does that mean? It means that even going to the home page is asking me to log in. If I try and click on any of these, they're all going to ask me to log in, because even as an anonymous user, I now have access to nothing. So that's all fine. If I now log in as me, and say nope, now I'm logged in. What's important to note is that I have access to /*. That means that I'm allowed as my user Luke to access anything on the whole site. I've also got the admin in, but clearly the first route overrides that route anyway. So that means I now as Luke can not only log into all of these different things, but I can also go to my permissions, and then that's all fine, and I can log out. So then we say, well, this is not really usable anymore, is it? Because it means if I'm not registered on this site, I can't actually access any pages. So what the plugin allows you to do is specify certain parts of the site that you are allowed to access. I haven't looked yet whether this needs to be an array or just a comma delimited list. But in this case, what I've said is, well, by default, let's let people access everything under the site controller, and then not let people access anything else. So now if I go back, I can now, I'm not logged in, I can access any of these because they're all under the site controller. I can't access books because books is not in the site controller. I can't access author for the same reason. I can't see the permission button, but more importantly, if I try and access it directly, again it's going to ask me to log in, and that's because this system here has said that every time you try and access something, we're going to call into this access control, and it's set up to deny everything by default. So that really is belt and braces in order to actually restrict access to your site. And with a little bit of careful planning, again, you'll have to ask the question, you know, can I put all of my anonymous pages under one controller? And that might make it easier then to filter it. Or am I going to end up with a big long list of different routes that I need to allow an anonymous user into? But as you can see, really, this is the ultimate in protection of the site. So when you're logged in, you can do what you need to do. See, I can't access that there, but if I go into books and if I log in as me, again, I can now access my books controller, my authors and everything else. So as you can see, it's really quite straightforward using it in code. Like I say, the difficult thing is, number one, planning how you're going to set up your roles and permissions, and then B, using either this the admin plugin or indeed any other plugin, or you could even write one yourself, you know, any one of these pages, in order to actually set all of that up. But once you've done, then it's all kind of pretty easy and hopefully mostly going to run out of the box. And using routes is a very simple and powerful way, an easy way of controlling access to your various controllers and actions without going through every single different one and trying to restrict it. You can obviously restrict things even more. So you could say that I will let everybody into perhaps, I don't know, site about. Oh no, that's probably a bad example. Let's look at, open the site controller. So maybe things like log out. We know that you're only allowed to log out if you're logged in. So even though I've said to people that you are allowed to get into here even as an anonymous user, by further restricting this by using the existing system and saying that they need to be a member of the authenticated users, then this further restricts the action of logout to only work on people who are not authenticated. So all of these rules can cascade down, and now that you've got the rbac installed, you can now replace these with things like are they an admin or a sysadmin or whatever. But in general, we don't like tying permissions to roles, and the reason is the logic of who can do what is supposed to be contained in the rbac database tables and not in code. And as soon as you start checking that users are in certain roles, then you're moving that logic down into your code, and you're implying that if I put admin in here, then forevermore every admin can always log out. And of course that might not always be true, and I might want to modify that, and I want to modify it in the database and not have to then go through all my code and try and find out what's what. So you're always better off sticking to permissions in there rather than role names, and you can then create a whole big nested list of permissions. So that's all fairly straightforward. In terms of caching, one of the concerns that people have is how many times this is going to be going to the database every time you're trying to do something, and that's a fair question. What actually happens in the user is it has a local cache, but it's fairly clunky. It doesn't use memory cache, it just uses a local array. And what that means is, as it says here, it's only effective within the same request. So if you ask for various permissions 4 times in the same request, there will only be one call to the database. But clearly that's not really very effective caching. So I've also noticed that there's another plugin called ye2-rbac-cached. And what that does is it implements all of the rbac management, but it includes memory caching in addition to the array caching. And then obviously you can then give it a lifetime and use your local memory to actually buffer some of those calls to the database. So it doesn't have to be too bad, and the actual amount of data going and coming back is not massive, but clearly that is going to be a consideration for larger sites. And then I think the only other thing that I want to mention here is, if you were taking this to an extreme, then I would suggest that the schema of these database tables is not particularly efficient, because, for instance, although this makes it nice and easy to read by using the string names as keys, really this should be using integer keys to be efficient and to make this table nice and small, and that would mean the auth item should have an ID column rather than just a name, and again that makes the indexes quicker, it makes some of the joins and stuff in the database quicker, but clearly that would be a fairly major change to the schema and might well involve making some other changes in the DB manager. What it would actually involve is inheriting the current DB manager, which is the one in the framework, with your own version of it, and then you would have to obviously modify certain ones of these calls to make sure that they still work. So I don't think that would be a problem unless your system got very, very large, but that's certainly something that you might want to think about moving forwards. But I hope that that is explained the rbac system fairly well and shown you that it's fairly straightforward to do. There isn't a lot of code to do. There's just a little bit of theory. There is a whole lot of design and thinking about how you want to split your users up, how to design your role hierarchy, and then there's all the fun and games of actually using the admin pages or even a script or a migration to actually populate all these tables with the relevant data. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video. If you have, as always, any questions or comments, please add them to the comments below. Thanks very much.